Hey, this is Alex. We're back with another episode of The Report. Tyler reports back from RETTC's Tech Executive Summit. We've got a big AI story on a historic world's first. Camden's 2025 National Study on Multifamily Workforce Trends report is out. And as an overall theme, we're seeing why 2026 is looking more like a year where the winners just execute better. Let's jump in. Before we jump in today's episode, quick update on the Forum, our user conference. We are nearly sold out. The event is March 24th to 26th in Scottsdale, Arizona, at a 5-star resort. We've got some of the largest property management owners and operators in the country, great speakers, Mia Hamm, Jay Parsons, Christy Simonette, Clay Bavor, and others. We're going to be focused on AI, centralization, and the human experience. Get tickets while you can before we sell out completely. Tyler, recording this on Monday, March 2nd. You just got back last week from Coral Gables, RETTC's Tech Executive Summit meeting, which was, I know, intentionally small and working session focused. Tell me a little bit about the most useful disagreements that were happening at RETTC and whether it changed your mind about anything.
RETTC is awesome, and I was skeptical. And I've been told that the early days of OpTech were similarly very small. The vendor to operator ratio was a little bit better than what OpTech is today, or a lot of the conferences we go to. And I say that as the vendor who messes up the ratios. But I think what's made RETTC so awesome is the text of what's going on in our industry right now. And so it's a group that really aligned around a purpose. And so that purpose in many ways is tied to the shifting sands of regulation, fee transparency, us having this kind of transition towards larger operators in the industry. And so there's not one particular disagreement that stands out to me, Alex. Rather, what I would say stands out is, in fact, the kind of camaraderie around, hey, we're going to compete with each other, but we want to compete by the same set of rules. So I think fee transparency is the most obvious example of that, that it doesn't behoove anybody. First of all, everybody was sharing that we're on the side of renters here. We want fee transparency as well. We want clarity for renters. The tricky part is when you have a different set of standards by market or a different set of standards by operator. And so seeing the operators all moving in this direction, led in many cases by some of the larger operators, right? The Greystars, the GIDs, who have really been big leaders in this. But it was a really fun opportunity to dive into a ton of topics. I think probably the bigger, perhaps, disagreement or debate that's out there continues to be just the role that AI plays in housing. And not that anybody's opposed to it. Is it worth spending time on autonomous buildings? Or is it really better spending time on the intersection of where the human delivers the superior experience? So all in all, though, big fan of NMHC's new group, RETTC or RETTC, and certainly something that Funnel's very proud to be a member of and on the committees that are really deciding a lot of important policy for how we operate, how we manage data in the industry.
Let's jump into the news. One in particular that was exciting for us, Funnel processed the world's first rent payment inside ChatGPT. It was reported by a number of outlets, but we did it in partnership with BH Management. If you're not familiar with BH, they've got more than 93,000 units nationwide. They're number 11 on NMHC's last top managers list, 39th on the owners list. Marked a major step toward bringing truly agentic AI to property management workflows. So Tyler, when people hear, hey, you did a rent payment inside ChatGPT, they may assume that's a bit of a novelty, but the real story is obviously what it takes to let AI execute inside those foundational core systems without losing oversight. What guardrails made this viable, and how should operators think about adopting agentic workflows in a way that's both scalable and auditable?
Yeah, and I was really proud of the team, obviously the news on this. And in fact, at RETC last week, BH got a big applause from one of the committees for doing this. So that just makes us so excited when our partners are leading the industry. And let me start with, just before we get into the specifics, the why, because I do think that's a question we get asked of, are there a lot of renters that need this? And technology never is about the masses at first. It is always about what is possible, right? And then you let the consumers guide you. And we all know as consumers, we're using the LLMs more. Everything from, hey, redesign my living room to where can I find a good restaurant? There's a million use cases. And so this is a use case that obviously is near and dear to operators' hearts, helping your consumers pay their rent. Nothing more important than that, paying the bills. And the use case being proven feasible, that a renter was able to go in and, in a conversation with ChatGPT, get their balance, make their payment, set up an auto payment, and they never had to log in during that experience of the resident portal. Really changed the game in terms of, hey, it's a whole new channel. And the example that I like to remind people is when I came into multifamily in 2012, about 3% of renters were paying rent online, period. So in about a decade, we went from 3% to 100%. Today, there's one renter in all of America who paid their rent via ChatGPT. It's not even a percent, it's one. But it is not a stretch to think that is going to be double digits in the next couple of years, that it could be the norm in a decade. And so proving feasibility is important. So then to your question, Alex, of, well, how is it feasible? What are the guardrails? The first thing is your technology providers need to be modernizing themselves to interact with the LLMs. And so to nerd out for a second, there's this term called model context protocol. Essentially is that funnels data and our customers' data needs to be interacting with these LLMs in a model that they are comfortable with, so we can take advantage of their interfaces and vice versa. And that sets up then a secure, and this is different than, if for anybody who pays attention to technology, you may have heard of things like Claude Bot. Not Claude. Claude is awesome. It's a tool from Anthropic and you can use it. Yardi did a really cool press release where they set up an MCP and via Claude, you can connect to it. Claude Bot is a open source, which means not really owned by a company, but owned by the community and accessible to a lot of people, way that you can build really cool agents. That sort of thing is not ready for the prime time of secure rent payments. It would inadvertently potentially expose PII. So we're talking about highly secure guardrails. And so Funnel ultimately was connecting our secure infrastructure to do payments for BH, integrated with their property management software in real time, but in a whole new operating system, a whole new channel, rather than on a resident portal. Now, behind the scenes, you're still accessing that resident portal, you're still hitting the property management software. And it fundamentally tells you there's going to be a world for every single existing technology provider if they modernize and provide the rails. And most importantly, I'll use the term, this is not simply ask a chatbot, what's my balance? This is then empower said agent to go and make an action on my behalf. In this case, make a payment, set up a recurring payment without me necessarily every single time having to log into that account and do it myself. Self-service will have a place, but there will also be a percentage of consumers in the future that, they make, rather than logging into my Delta app and my Uber app and my Funnel app, I'm just in my ChatGPT app and I've connected those other accounts so that I let it act on my behalf inside of those. That's what agentic means, is giving it a sense of autonomy to complete tasks. So we're just so proud of BH being willing to say yes. And last thing, I realize I haven't told this part of the story. This speed, you hear a lot of people talking today about the speed of development. This is probably one of those moments for me that I felt it. The idea, and my first conversation with Joanna Zabriskie, the CEO of BH, about this, I'm going to go check my text, but I think it was probably in December. And we made that first rent payment in February. That is how fast the world is moving right now. And credit to our engineers and our co-founder, Mike O'Toole, who uses these coding development assistants to help him move faster. Like, the pace of innovation in multifamily is going to pick up because it's picking up all over the industry and all over technology in general.
It's wild. I had a ton of folks that I know outside of multifamily just reach out and tell me how cool it was that happened. And so multifamily, you don't often see leading the charge on these things, but the fact that we're out there ahead of most people out there is very cool. We finally have a few more details on Trump's housing policy, a topic we discussed on last report. Big hat tip to Jay Parsons, who broke this down. He'll be speaking at Forum. So it's not a blanket ban on institutional ownership. It's really framed around investors with at least 100 homes. Could land on mid-sized local regional groups more than the biggest headline villains typically. The carve-outs seem to matter. It reportedly exempts build-to-rent and investors who substantially renovate homes to rent them out. So some scaled rental supply models may be protected, not punished. It also doesn't read like an immediate forced sell-off, so it's less mass disruption tomorrow and more of a policy signal that could shape sentiment, capital, and strategy, even if Congress never passes it. So these headlines, Tyler, they really enforce recurring public narrative that housing is rigged. From your seat, what's one concrete thing operators could do today to start building back some of that renter trust?
Yeah, you nailed it. The last word there is trust. And I think that has to be first and foremost with renters. I, as somebody who's rented from an individual landlord and somebody who's rented from, quote, big landlords or institutional landlords, it really comes down to the relationship at the end of the day. And it is critical in a world with more technology and AI conversations that residents feel a sense of relationship with their landlord. And that begins at the initial inquiry, right? And we're seeing all over LinkedIn these days these examples. Our friend Lisa Trozine has posted about this of just how bad we're getting as an industry at using AI, which Funnel is one of the largest sellers of AI in this industry. So trust me, I love it. But come on, we need to have a personal touch. We need to start the relationship from the get go and not have people feel like I'm just pinging corporation ABC and they're giving me their stuffed canned answer. People want to feel connected. And all of us who have rented an apartment community can remember being taken on a tour, right? You can remember walking into the leasing office and having some interaction with a human. And that could be on the phone. There's myriad ways that you can do that, but trust is a relationship. And so I think that in this world in which there's going to continue to be, in this case, we're talking about federal policy that I'm sure at Forum, our friend Jay Parsons will really expound on how misguided this is in terms of the outcomes that you want to achieve. If the outcomes are that we want to achieve better housing affordability, punishing landlords is not that. We can talk about that issue, but I think that you asked the right question, which is more so, how do I respond as an operator? And I think the reality is I need to lean into building trust with my individual renters. And the more that I can do that through establishing a relationship with them, the less likely they are to perceive me as the big bad landlord. Now, that does not resolve you from the potential legislative risks that are going to come, but ultimately, operators will be just fine if they maintain 93+% occupancy and high renewal rates. And so the legislative environment is always going to be tricky. In fact, one of our stories is about the REITs talking about how messy it is right now out there. But if you're operating your business and establishing trust and your renters believe that they can trust you to stay in your building and that you're going to take good care of them, you'll be just fine.
Let's talk about a couple of stories that are around that supply issue. News to probably no one listening, it is a pro-renter market today. Vacancies are up, rent growth is soft. Number of outlets tied some quote-unquote fresh reporting back to the same core concept that new supply, slower demand is resulting in more choices for renters, pushing operators toward record-breaking concessions and tighter revenue expectations. It's not a story of rents are crashing everywhere. It's pricing power getting super localized with the most pressure often seen at the higher end of Class A luxury apartments where new deliveries tend to cluster. There was an article in Zillow that stated multifamily rent growth is expected to stay basically flat into year end, with affordability improving as vacancies stay elevated. Tyler, teams can't optimize everything at once in a year like 2026 is looking to be. Where do you see our partners being most successful? Where should they stop spending their time and spend more time because some of those results could compound more effectively?
I want to go back to the last question was about policy. And unfortunately, having run a business for a few years and throughout my career, I've come to recognize that perception sometimes lags behind reality. And it's unfortunately, you still see a lot of articles out there about the housing crisis. And broadly speaking, as a category, rentals, this is the most affordable period in like decades that we have had years of essentially no rent growth, right? So renters have been getting more buying power, purchasing power over the last couple of years. And so that's a huge win. And we should frankly talk more about that as an industry that we're helping on affordability because we provided so much more supply. Now, the inverse side of that, of course, is that provides a lot of pressure on operators to execute really well. And I think you're seeing a bifurcation, Alex. And your question is really about how do you survive an environment in which your core product is harder to sell and harder to monetize at a higher rate when costs continue to go up and there's more competition and it's not stopping. And I think what we're seeing is again this kind of you hear macroeconomists talk about a K-shaped economy for various elements of the economy. I think we're seeing that as well in housing operations. That there's been a lot of stories recently about regional operators, subscale operators moving out of the management business and pairing up with the Greystar, pairing up with the ZRS, right? Pairing up with BH and Cortland and some of these larger third-party managers. Morgan is growing tremendously. And really what that tells us is that this is a unique opportunity to have a differentiated service model. And you can do that, to your point, when you have more competition, lower demand because of that increase of competition, you have to execute at a higher level. And we're thrilled when we see stats like what we've seen from our partners at ZRS, where they're increasing the number of tours that they're able to book, they're increasing the show rate on those tours. And that's done through a combination of AI and centralization, right? Which I really think my big takeaway for folks is that if from probably the 1980s until 2008 and 20, you could simply, and actually 2022, you could simply staff a property with the old model and you're going to stay leased and you're going to be able to grow rents in a challenging environment like this. If you want to be one of the companies that survives and thrives in that environment and is there to capture every time when I came into the workforce, it was I worked for a home builder during the great financial crisis. And I remember my first meeting, I was like a weekend. I got to sit in like a 100-person all hands meeting with the CEO. And he said, guys, it's not going to be as good as the last 2 or 3 years. But if we can weather this storm, we will be, a company called Ivory Homes, we will be the best positioned on the back side of this to take advantage of the growth. And Ivory Homes has gone on to be the top home builder in Utah and in the Mountain West because they were one of the companies that survived. And there was a ton of home builders that got wiped out in the great financial crisis. Those who survived had their best decade ever after. I think similarly, we are seeing a clearing of property management companies that did not truly innovate, have not truly embraced. A lot of people say they centralized, but the companies that centralized, like a Camden, who saved $4 million and simultaneously continue to deliver great customer service, are going to survive. And ultimately, that's the answer, Alex, is that tough times build tough characters. And I think the operators that grow and thrive through these tough times are going to be better positioned. They're better operators than they were when they came into it. So we're seeing that fewer leads, higher conversion ratios, better employee to unit ratios, right? Better pay for those employees that are still there. So yes, it's tough, but ultimately those tough environments create better operators. And ultimately the renters win in that because they have more choice, they have more housing affordability, and they're being serviced better than they were before.
Back to your comment on the last question, it's about earning their trust, right? If you can get in there and show them there's a better experience for them at your location. Let's jump to a multifamily dive piece. The headline was REITs are planning around a messy 2026. So a bunch of the coverage of REITs of late has emphasized that even the biggest, best capitalized players are treating 2026 as very uneven. Operations matter more than macro narratives, and some are repositioning portfolios rather than just waiting for rent growth to come back. Apartment REIT commentary pointed to challenging near-term income growth and strategic moves like asset sales with concessions explicitly discussed. It reinforces a broader signal to the industry that you need to out-execute the market. So underwriting, ops plans are leaning harder on controllables, turn times, conversion, fraud collection, centralized leasing performance, rather than rent growth assumptions. Consistency matters more than heroics. Where are you seeing centralized teams and AI make the biggest difference right now? And what are we building to make that consistency repeatable across every community, not just the best run ones?
Amazing. And I think that if this sounds like the last topic, it's because it is, but I want to highlight the core there of how are those who are going to outperform going to do it and how have they been doing it. And this is a topic we've talked on a lot about at Funnel, which is that a lot of folks try different strategies, and then when they don't work, they point it and say that was the problem. And the REITs had been centralizing before rents fell. And so they know centralization has to stay. Some of the third-party managers who tried centralization as rent growth fell off, there was this tendency from asset managers to point the finger and say, oh, centralization didn't work. Let's throw AI at it. And then when AI doesn't magically solve the problem, now let's go back to centralization. And I think the reality is you have to have both. And it's very simple. You don't need to have a PhD in multifamily to understand this. But when you try to throw AI at a fragmented process, you will not save money. You will save a little bit of time and you will slightly improve the renter experience. I, as a consumer, would rather be able to book my tour on a Sunday rather than waiting till Monday when I'm at work for you to follow up with me. That's a win, but I'm not going to improve my unit economics that way, which is why, again, you're seeing these third-party managers grow massively, and we love to see that, and they're getting better at it. But the real cost savings that you're seeing with the Camden, for instance, is that you have to be able to aggregate the work first. And then ultimately, when you do have the automation opportunities, for instance, voice AI technology has gotten radically better in the last 2 years than where it was a couple of years ago, meaning that a high volume of your calls will willingly, and it's one thing to not give renters an exit. I don't think that's the right choice. I think you should give renters the ability to talk to a human always, even if you have great technology. And the barometer of if you're doing it well is they choose to talk to the AI anyway, right? And that used to be like in the single digit percentage. We're now seeing that with some of our partners north of 50%. You can get it as high as 80% if you really optimize for it. It should never be 100% because if you're doing 100%, that means that you're not giving them an off ramp. That's not the ideal customer service experience, though it is a cost savings opportunity. Really, the opportunity is to find aggregate work, automate the beginning of it for the consumers that are willing to let you have an AI automated experience, and then aggregate and specialize the remaining work. When you do that across the size portfolios we have in multifamily today, cost savings are there. And so that's how you outperform is you have to specialize, you have to centralize, you have to automate, and you can't do a slice of it. We've seen a lot of our operators do a slice of it, and you just don't get the full peanut butter and jelly experience of centralization plus automation, which not only yields improved employee to unit ratios, simultaneously delivers really great customer experience. We're very glad to be partnered to 4 of the 6 big REITs. And in doing so, you can see that, again, in tough times, they're still continuing to operate, and that FFO, funds from operations, continue to move in the right direction.
You mentioned Camden briefly there. They just released their 2025 national study of multifamily workforce trends report. A lot of interesting data in there, but we'll zoom in on one piece. The report put a spotlight on the earliest moments that really make or break employee retention. They found 74% of employees decide within the first month whether they'll stay. And with 83% ranking working smart, quote unquote, as a top value for job satisfaction. So, Tyler, what does that mean? What does work smart actually look like in leasing or centralized models? And what changes in process, coaching, and tooling need to happen to work a little bit smarter?
Yeah, and yeah, highly recommend anybody check out Camden's LinkedIn. They shared this story. They know what they're talking about. If you've interacted with somebody who used to work at Camden, you know that they hold that experience in high praise. There are industries throughout there are leaders throughout the industry that came from that culture, similar to an Archstone, where you find these individuals leading companies all over the place. Leaders from Camden are all over the multifamily industry. And so them talking about culture and employee development, talent development, that got my attention. And so I thought it was really interesting that we all see this. A lot of companies say they're slow to hire, quick to fire. That's not the reality, but employees are, right? They recognize when they get in somewhere, they make a judgment call very quickly about what kind of work am I going to be expected to do here. And if within a month I'm being asked to do menial, redundant, grinding type of work, I'm probably already back on LinkedIn looking for my next job. But if I'm being challenged, but in a way that is growing me, in a way that I find genuinely fulfilling, then I'm going to lean in. And we all know it's that first kind of 90 days that you're not getting maybe the ROI out of your net new employee. You need him to stay 100 plus days where you start really getting the employee ROI. And so Camden is one of our customers who has really leaned into this role specialization. They eliminated the ACM role. That does not mean they eliminated all of the positions. They created bigger, better jobs, which is a phrase that actually a Camden alumni, Tom Sloan, helped create a GID with their Windsor 2025 initiative. But they created bigger, better jobs where I'm no longer a single community assistant community manager. I am now a general manager over multiple communities, or I'm a specialist, right, in resident operations and resident support, or specialist in sales across multiple communities. And it also creates better career paths that align with individual talents, and it creates more compensation upside. So, what a lot of our partners have seen, and Camden is certainly one of these, is that they actually can pay a smaller group because they're specialized and centralized a higher individual compensation. And if you're not as familiar with multifamily or you don't believe that, this also exists in other industries. The same thing is true of Costco. Costco has way better retention than Walmart, and they pay their employees way more. But shocker, they also have the most efficient stores. Their employee to square foot ratio is insane. And so these things that sometimes seem like at odds with each other really aren't, right? If you buy into both and deliver great customer service, you can have great employee retention, and you can pay the individuals more. Duh, no brainer. It's just you got to do it all. You got to be committed to it. You have to do the whole operating model. You can't, again, take a little bite of it.
And in Camden's case, they even get Sundays off. Plus, I like how you were going outside multifamily to think of Costco, but if you recall, they're now building multifamily buildings here in California. So that's going to overlap pretty soon too. Rent regulation is back in the headlines again. In Massachusetts, the mayor of Boston just endorsed a statewide rent control ballot push with some caps tied to inflation or 5%, reigniting a debate the state historically rejected. In New York City, there's been some coverage highlighting affordability commitments and the constraints of implementing rent freezes, plus a bigger supply bottleneck there in that city. But even when legislation doesn't pass immediately, the pushes and efforts around bringing the topic back to the forefront, can really affect investment sentiment, development feasibility, and political pressure on owners and operators, especially in supply constrained coastal markets. Tyler, when rent regulation headlines and activity heat up, even before anything gets passed, it really changes the conversation that leaders are having in our space. From what you're hearing, what questions start showing up in boardrooms and executive meetings first when policy risk spikes? And how do you think that pressure reshapes the priorities?
Yeah, going back to the REIT, the first thing you hear is, that there's a capital flow away from those markets. Capital rotates out. The dollars want to go to the markets where it's easier for them to develop and it's easier for them to get ROI. For those that are in those markets and have no choice but to operate, they begin looking for other opportunities as well within that. Okay, if we have rent caps, what are we allowed to charge for? The folks in multifamily across the political spectrum recognize that rent control just isn't the answer. And it's proven time and time again. And so I'm very impressed by the operators who are committed to markets where you see a lot of that regulation and more of it, because the reality is that capital doesn't have to be committed to a market. They can say, hey, forget that. We're going to go invest in places where it's easier to develop. But for the operators that are in those markets, they really have to operate on fine margins, they have to operate with smaller playbooks, and they have to just outperform. And so it is still possible. Everything that we've talked about in the show of leaning into automation, leaning into centralization, I will say though, it begins to be apparent that the opportunities are in the places where the growth is going to come, right? Talent is going to follow that, development is going to follow that, and ultimately renters will as well when there's more options and better housing affordability in those markets. Count us as on the side of a supply-oriented housing policy. A lot of respect for operators that work in these tough markets. And I think there's a difference between we as a housing industry are certainly not anti-regulation or anti-pro-consumer sentiment. And I think fee transparency is a great example of that, that we as an industry have rallied around, let's make this a win for both the operators and for the consumers. But yeah, housing regulation where you're imposing rent control has just been proven empirically at this point to not yield the types of results that we need. So operators, we've got so much respect for those that have to work in those tough environments and figure out a way to still perform.
There was a really interesting piece in Bloomberg about a nearly 100-year-old Supreme Court decision. It involved this growing movement to reform land use rules that continually constrain housing supply, which is relevant because zoning reform or backlash toward it is one of the few levers that can really materially change the supply curve over years or decades. So zoning is basically the operating system for where housing is allowed to exist. Philosophically, Tyler, how do you think about the balance between local control and the broader need to add supply? And what do you wish more people understood about why this issue keeps resurfacing in housing conversations?
Yeah, well, this is a bigger one. I'm not a constitutional attorney, and I think that folks that are well intentioned at every level have their arguments. Why said earlier in the show that I think that we as an industry need to continue to tell the story that supply is working and renters, again, as an operator, makes your job harder when rents don't grow. But as an industry, it's a fantastic story that we've been able to deliver quality product. Man, if anybody hasn't visited these new lease ups, they are incredible, right? These are so nice. And so the ability to deliver super high quality product at essentially flat prices shows that supply is the answer. And over time, the beauty of the American economy is that there is consumers can move around as well. And so I think that we have seen in certain places a willingness to embrace YIMBYism, the opposite of NIMBYism. Yes, in my backyard. But no matter what, you will always have pockets push back on that. And that will create consumer choice. Where I live, the funnel office is just on the county side of Pasco County in Florida. And then I live across the county in Hillsborough. And even in Florida, which is pretty obviously a red state, you have different county regulations. And Pasco is pro development, and there's a lot more apartments on this side of the line than this side of the line. And because of that, they pay less taxes because there's so much coming in the development side. And so there's always going to be those trade-offs, and that's okay. The competition is good even within local jurisdictions. But we just need to continue to do our part as an industry to tell the story that is, while it's difficult for us as operators to deal with a lack of rent growth, when supply comes into demand, where there's enough demand, you're going to see that be the right answer for housing affordability.
Thank you, Tyler. That's a wrap. We hope to see many of you listening at the forum in a couple of weeks. Talk soon.
Thanks, Alex.